Thank you, Julianne and Alan and everybody else who has made this conference possible. And I also want to say thanks to John Lott. My name is Timothy Wheeler, MD. I'm the Director of Doctors for Responsible Gun Ownership. I was going to say thanks to John Lott and the Crime Prevention Research Center for taking on the huge task, the challenging task of trying to counter the flood of junk science that we're getting funded by Michael Bloomberg and the foundations that we've dealt with for many years now. At Doctors for Responsible Gun Ownership, we also want to do that. And we also want to give you some practical advice on how to deal with some of the problems that have come up because of the public health community's sustained assault on the right to keep and bear arms. I'm going to introduce each of these speakers up here individually in a minute, but just very quickly, from my left, we have Robert Young, MD. On the right here, we have Arthur Pishpenda, MD. And on the very end, somebody you've heard before, John Edine, MD. This is my leadership team, our leadership team of Doctors for Responsible Gun Ownership. I'm going to let them do the talking today. But before I sit down and let them start, I want to tell you about one resource that's available to you now on our website, DRGO.us, which Arthur, by the way, has turned into a wonderful instrument for getting our word out. I encourage you to go there. We have fresh blog content twice weekly, and we have a resource there that I want to tell you about that's pretty timely now. It actually has gotten about, last time I looked, about 60,000 hits. And it's a resource called What to Do When Your Doctor Asks About Your Guns. It's right there on the opening page, drgo.us. All right. Since the beginning of the Republic, people have emigrated to these shores from Poland, and they have become some of our best American citizens and some of our most fervent supporters of our natural rights. And one of those is Arthur Pishpenda, MD, to my immediate right. Arthur is a diagnostic imaging specialist in Southern California. Actually, he's in the Los Angeles area right down the freeway from me. He is the social media editor for Doctors for Responsible Gun Ownership. He focuses on the behind-the-scenes operation of DRGO in order to build the organization's brand equity and our message penetration. As I said, Arthur's originally from Poland, from the former Soviet bloc. He was introduced to shooting by his uncle, who is also an IPSC competitor and a former Polish army marksman. And Arthur is a student of the gun who cherishes the Second Amendment in its complete and unabridged interpretation. Ladies and gentlemen, Arthur Pishpenda, MD.
Hi, everyone. My name is Arthur, and I'm a California gun owner. So, my official, can everybody hear me okay? My official title is social media editor. Close to the mic? Okay, thank you. In that facility, my job was to revamp and operate the organization's website and its Facebook and its Twitter feed. And the aim of that is to engage the public in an effort to affect public opinion and get our message out to the public. Ultimately, I want to put DRGO and our ideas in the consciousness of, first, the general public and ultimately policymakers. To do that, we're going to need to leverage the media. And so what I ultimately think of myself as is the brand manager, not so much just a website operator. And what I want to be guided by is Margaret Thatcher's principle that first you win the argument, then you win the vote. Gun rights are ascendant, but as many have asserted here, this is a fight that will never be over. And we will have to fight it continuously. The role of DRGO is to leverage our authority and our respected positions as physicians to, and other health professionals who are members of DRGO, to advance the normalization of firearms ownership. The way we do that currently through our regular operations is through regular blog content, which includes commentary on current events, responses to a number of public health studies. As Dr. Lott has mentioned, we'll see more of those. And in certain instances in the past and probably in the future, offering testimony and information and education to policymakers as requested. Again, my aim and the aim of all these activities is to get pro-Second Amendment thinking, views and sentiments into the heads of Americans, more Americans, and especially policymakers. So how can DRGO work with your group? There's a couple of ways. First and foremost, if you're an operator of a blog or some other website, we publish content frequently. We like to think that some of it is very insightful and very poignant. Follow our blog. You're welcome to republish with attribution. If you have questions about how to do that, contact us through the website. Secondly, all three of my colleagues are very skilled and experienced in speaking publicly, on radio show, podcasts, etc. If you need someone to appear on your a show to discuss a particular issue, feel free to contact us. We can arrange an appearance. If you have any interest in cooperating with us in dismantling and rebuking some of these bogus studies that we're going to be seeing more of, especially if you have experience in epidemiological work or statistical work, contact us. We're likely to find a way to cooperate. And if DRGO can work with you in whatever your organization does, feel free to contact us and we can talk about working together. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Adine.
Thank you, Arthur. Our next speaker is a psychiatrist, a practicing psychiatrist who writes for Doctors for Responsible Gun Ownership at drgo.us. And Dr. Young here has ascended the learning curve in about a year or so from not writing much at all to being a regularly published writer. He's been published in National Review Online, Washington Times. He's appeared on NRA News several times and done other media work for us as well. He was invited to the American Medical Association convention to give a presentation on in support of Florida's Firearms Owners Privacy Act, which you've heard me talk about before from this podium. Dr. Young is an associate clinical professor of psychiatry at the University of Rochester School of Medicine, and he's a distinguished fellow of the American Psychiatric Association. Rob has been recognized for excellence in teaching, and he practices in the Rochester, New York area. Ladies and gentlemen, Robert B. Young, MD.
Thank you, Tim. I go by Rob to my friends. I see about 600 of them or so out here. To me, there's been an amazing amount of discussion here today involving mental health issues. I'm glad to hear that. It's very complicated. And in fact, it turns out that a number of the things I'm going to say have already been said, so please forgive me, but I'll try to tie them together in a little bit different way for you. I'm from Missouri. Who's from Missouri? Okay. I grew up in the Ozarks. Bought my first rifle at the age of 16 at the hardware store. Boy, do I miss those days. And then I moved to New York State. Yes, I'm sorry in a number of ways, although I'll get to one way a little bit later that it's probably a good thing. But it was for professional reasons, and it's a good place to practice psychiatry, and you can take that any way you want. So you've heard that most all mass murderers apparently have some kind of mental illness. Now they aren't all in treatment, as John Lott just said. Maybe 52% of them have been. I haven't pinned it down that far. But if you count them up, probably all but one over the last 10 or 20 years had some sort of problem of that sort. And I'm talking about something that isn't a significant issue in the whole frame of, quote, gun violence either. And you all know that, right? You know, mass murder victims are a fraction of a percent overall. That's not where the problem is. But people want to talk about that, so I'm going to talk about it. I see a lot of guns in here. You all feel safe? Yeah. Me too. About 50% of Americans in their lifetimes will have a diagnosable mental illness of some kind. Now that involves around 200 different possible diagnoses. And that's not just psychiatrists trying to work up business. We're overwhelmed as it is. About 25% of us at any given time have a diagnosable mental illness. Unfortunately, most of us actually aren't getting treated at the time. Now look around. Do you still feel safe? Well, you should. You should, because people with mental illnesses commit violence, and I don't mean just murder, I mean violence of any kind, at a much lower rate than that of the population in general. So even though psychiatrists are perhaps the most vulnerable specialists to violence by patients, it doesn't really worry me day in, day out, and it hasn't for the last 30 years, and it shouldn't the American population in general. And let's see, where are we going here? What am I doing up here? I'd call it 10% of violent crime. About 5% of people with about 5% of violent crime is committed by people with some form of mental illness. About another 5% of people with a combination of mental illness and substance abuse. I'm going to skip over substance abuse. If you have questions about that, I'll talk about it at the question and answer, because it's a bit more complicated a topic. If we're going to talk about diagnoses, the chief risks are probably three. Paranoid states, particularly schizophrenia, paranoid schizophrenia, in which someone is sick enough that they start worrying so much that they are vulnerable to harm that they may at some point choose a good offense as their best defense. Major depression, of course, in which suicide is always a risk. And suicide is probably the biggest issue certainly in mental illness and death, and certainly in mental illness and misuse of guns, of course. And then I would add to that severe combat PTSD. And those can present, of course, with risks of both homicide and suicide. As you heard from Dr. Lott, I can't predict violence very well. No one can. Psychiatrists like me are probably better than average. But if I'm talking to somebody with their entire history and I'm asked to say whether they're likely to be violent over the next 24 hours, I have about a 50-50 chance of being right. Okay, you all know what that means, good. And that's better than most people can hit, even though it sounds like it's purely random. Okay, I'm going to touch on a number of things and then try to tie them together. One of the big issues in background checks and in discussion about how to prevent violence by people with mental illness. It has to do with the criteria that we use currently. It boils down to adjudication of a mental illness. Now, that can happen in several ways. It can actually happen by a judge. Typically, that would be in a proceeding to assess guardianship. Let's say somebody's demented. It happens all the time when we commit someone for treatment, especially to an inpatient unit. That has to happen if you're sick enough and dangerous enough. The problem, of course, is that follows you the rest of your life. I can adjudicate someone as mentally defective just by putting them in the hospital to treat them, to make them well, so that they do not represent a danger or perhaps even have that mental illness again. That's a terrible thing about our entire system, of course. And I'll point out that when people are talking about competence, and we're talking about the VA and the Social Security Administration problems, there are many kinds of competence. I may be asked to decide if someone can cooperate in their defense in a criminal proceeding. I may be asked if someone's capable of handling their money. Of course, there's a defense against criminal convictions by reason of insanity. And there are other more neurologically based incompetences that can have to do with pure functions like the capacity to express or to receive communication. So, as you've heard, just because there's one sort of incompetence, even the inability to manage money, that has nothing to do with anything else, including the potential to manage a firearm safely. Next time I'm putting this all on one page. All right. Okay, so what can we do about all this? You've heard about the population-wide lack of value of background checks. The same really would apply to NICS checks, we all know that. But they exist, and if we're going to use these things, at least they need to be complete. At least all states need to submit the same information the same ways. The problem then comes in how these things are applied. And just like when you get on a no-fly list, does anybody know how to get off the NICS prohibition? Not allowed. Sir? No, right. I have no clue. So once I commit you to a hospital, I have no clue how to get you off that. Except if you're in a state where say a permitting authority is interested in looking at your history, is willing to hear from someone who's treated you for years, like me in some cases. But that just can't apply to most people. So we really have to depend on all of us. We need to depend on family and friends. Because when someone starts to go bad, whether it's for a mental illness or otherwise, the people who are most likely to see it are the people who are closest to them. It isn't me. Once they get to see me, it's because someone else has gotten them to see me. And that isn't going to happen for most people. So from that need comes the idea, say, of gun violence restraining orders. I'm going to use that term, even though the prominent example in California is a pretty bad one for lack of real due process. And that's where I'm going to come to in just a minute. Sir. Uh-oh. Who's going to kick me off, you or Julie? All right. What they lack is due process. There's a model in New York that works fine. When I have to keep someone in the hospital longer than the initial commitment, when I have to force someone to take medicine, I have to go to a judge. The subject has to be there if they want to be there. They get free counsel then. And if I want to do it again, the same thing has to happen. And if they want to appeal, the same thing happens. That's due process. That's what should happen in all of these ways. If a family member thinks there's a problem, that's the way it should happen. That cuts down false accusations, and all of these things can shorten prohibition to the minimum necessary, which could be for a weekend, could be for 6 months, should be for whatever it takes, and it always should include, in the case of someone mentally ill, the commitment to treatment at that time. That's what gets them better. People who are treated are far less violent than people who are not. You've read about the association of psychiatric medicines with violence? Well, that's because we have to use them to treat people who may be violent. It's the illness, it's not the medicine. So, do you all know Martin Niemöller? Anybody? Anybody ever hear of him? German pastor who became gradually an opponent of the Nazis and earned 8 years in a concentration camp for the privilege. You probably have heard something like this. When they came for the socialists, I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. When they came for the trade unionists, I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. When they came for the Jews, I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak out. So I want to say right now to the 75% of you here, thank you very much for guarding the civil rights of the other 25% of us here. Thank you.
Thank you, Rob. Our last speaker, you recognize from previous gun rights policy conferences. He's a pediatric orthopedic surgeon who's in private practice in San Antonio for the past 18 years. He's the membership director of Doctors for Responsible Gun Ownership. He's a member, as I said, of our leadership team. He's written for our blog. He has also appeared as a guest on Armed America Radio with Mark Walters, who you heard earlier, Gun Talk, Handgun World podcast. He's also been a guest and a guest co-host on the Polite Society podcast. Dr. Adine is an NRA certified basic pistol instructor and a graduate of Masad Ayub Group's MAG 40 class. He continues to pursue firearms training and continues to organize courses for new shooters in the medical community. His passion is working toward the removal of gun-free zones, especially in hospitals. Ladies and gentlemen, John Adine, MD.
Thanks a lot. At least I don't have to follow Masad Ayub this year, so it's good. Last year I spoke at this meeting about my efforts to remove gun-free zones from hospitals. I'm still working towards that goal. The Texas legislature was able to pass licensed open carry and campus carry. They also passed knife preemption. Unfortunately, bills specifically addressing hospital carry, House Bill 308 and HB 395 by Representative Drew Springer, and Senate Bill 311 by Senator and Dr. Donna Campbell failed to make it through the legislative process. And the next session isn't until 2017. In 2014 and 2015, we saw an attack against a psychiatrist in Darby, Pennsylvania, and an attack against a heart surgeon in Boston, Massachusetts. Both of these places were designated as gun-free zones. Most hospitals in America are gun-free zones and thus are soft targets, and this is a problem. I'm going to talk about the terrorist threat against hospitals. With the recent increase in terrorist activity by ISIS and around the globe and the influx of Syrian refugees and ISIS cells in North America, we have to ask ourselves, what are their targets and how will they attack? John Gieduk, in his book, When Terror Returns, describes the optimal target site for a high magnitude hostage seize. It will be a structure that can be quickly secured and defended by a small team. It would allow large vehicles to approach with the terror team and weapons. It would also have little security and contain a sufficiently sized central location to hold hostages. It would also be have a victim population of desired composition whose scheduled presence was either predictable or easily ascertainable via rudimentary intelligence gathering. And in larger metropolitan areas, diversionary attacks would be used to delay the police. Most likely targets are schools and hospitals, but also things like Super K-marts, Walmarts, that kind of stuff. The history, in 2013, Dr. Boaz Ganor and Dr. Miri Halpern-Wernley of the International Institute of Counterterrorism wrote a white paper titled Terrorist Attacks Against Hospitals, Case Studies. They looked at approximately 100 terrorist attacks against hospitals worldwide in 43 countries on every continent, killing approximately 775 people and wounding 1,217 others between 1981 and 2013. They pointed out that the large number of patients, visitors, and medical staff ensure that an attack on hospitals will produce multiple casualties. It would also expect that attack on a facility dedicated to health and healing would receive extensive media coverage. An attack on a hospital is demoralizing to a community and increases anxiety due to the familiarity of the setting of fear that such an attack would involve either yourself or someone that you love. These also, hospitals hold materials and knowledge that can be used to further harm. These include medications, poisons, radioactive materials, and biological cultures. Also, confidential health information could be hacked and used for nefarious purposes. Hospitals can either be a primary or secondary target of attack. As a secondary target, it can be used to distract security and response assets from the primary attack. And as a primary target, we can see suicide attacks, bombings, kidnappings and negotiations, shootings, and even mortar and rocket attacks. The most costly example of an attack on a hospital happened in Budanovsk, Russia in June of 1995. 150 Chechen terrorists led by Samil Basayev took 2,000 hostages. 2,000 hostages. Okay, 129 civilians, 18 police, and 18 soldiers were killed. More than 400 people were wounded. Later, 18 people died of their wounds. The attack happened about 6 months after Russia invaded Chechnya. And I'm not going to go into the details. You can look it up. But basically, the demands were they wanted to stop the war in Chechnya. They wanted to pull out federal troops. And they wanted to start direct negotiations with the Chechen rebels to get the Russians out of Chechnya. There was a counterattack that happened, actually several counterattacks that happened, all of which failed. A lot of the hostages were killed with grenade fragments and in the crossfire. Finally, after about 5 days, the Prime Minister, Chernomyrdin, agreed to the hostages' demands, and they were actually allowed to leave Russia and go back to Chechnya, taking hostages with them. They took a circuitous route, and when they got to one of these small border towns, they released the hostages and disappeared into the woods, and were able to go back to Chechnya, okay? Not only that, but they were able to take an X-ray machine with them that had cesium-137, and as a result, they had the first dirty bomb attack. Okay, so think about this stuff. Okay, as a result, the Russian government and people were shaken. The Russian leadership was humbled and was seen as being inept. Boris Yeltsin was condemned. He was in charge at that time. The security and interior ministers resigned, and a law was passed banning accepting terrorist demands during hostage situations. So where do we go from here? We know that most suicide attacks at hospitals have been suicide bombings, with the second most common scenario being the armed assault. Hospitals are soft targets with multiple entrances. Visitors are seldom identified, and their baggage is seldom screened or searched. Many hospitals do not have a significant armed security presence, and a large size and long straight hallways give the advantage to the hostage takers. There have also been an upsurge in female suicide bombers. Hospitals have a large number of female employees who may be exploited by radical Islamists. Physicians are not immune. There have been several instances of attacks by radicalized doctors. Dr. Ayman al-Zawahiri was Osama bin Laden's number 2 in Al-Qaeda until Osama bin Laden was killed, and then he took over. Also, we all know about Dr. Nadal Hassan, the Army psychiatrist who killed 13 and wounded 32 in an attack at Fort Hood in Texas, my home state. There are many more examples. Hospitals contain the radioactive and biological materials. Often the security on those materials is inadequate. Hospitals have a legal responsibility to provide a safe and secure environment for staff, patients, and their families. Do hospitals have a liability risk in the age of terrorism? Is an attack a foreseeable event? Does your hospital have a plan? In the event of a local terrorist attack, does your hospital have a plan to secure the emergency department from suicide bombers? Is there a plan for ambulances and vehicles to be searched before they are allowed to approach the hospital itself? Would a plan to have a trained and armed hospital staff already in place be an advantage and possibly deter or disrupt the plans of hostage takers and allow staff and patients to escape? Imagine the devastation in your community if there was a Boston Marathon type bombing followed by a suicide bomb attack on the emergency department just as casualties begin to arrive. It could never happen, not here, not in my hospital, until it does. Thank you.